Good evening, and welcome back to another quiet descent into forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we begin a long journey to the lives of 5 rulers whose power was built not on love or honor, but on fear, pain, and blood. Ivan the Terrible. In the stillness of history's darker corners, a name lingers like a cold draft through ancient stone halls. Ivan. They called him Grozny in his native tongue, a word that doesn't quite mean terrible, but rather awe-inspiring, wrathful, thunderous. A boy-crowned czar, a man swallowed by paranoia, and a ruler who carved fear into the very soul of Russia. Before the bloodshed, before the madness, there was silence. A silence filled with watching eyes, locked doors, and whispered prayers. Tonight, we drift into that silence and trace the slow, merciless shaping of man the world would come to dread. Long before the thunder of hooves across frozen soil, long before the weeping of mothers in the silence of bloodied fields, there was a boy, small, sharp-eyed, and born into a palace that echoed more with secrets than with lullabies. Ivan Vasilyevic, later known as Ivan the Terrible, was not cradled by affection or steadied by guidance, but rather ushered into a world already cracking under the weight of ambition, betrayal, and fear. He was born in 1530, into a dynasty that both worshipped power and trembled before it, a child wrapped in royal silk, but laid to sleep in a cradle surrounded by vipers. His father, Vasily III, was a ruler desperate for legacy, a man who had married late and worried constantly about whether the bloodline of Rurik, that ancient thread that tied Russia to its mythic past, would continue. When Ivan was finally born, he was not greeted as a child but as an answer, a fragile but sacred solution to a problem of succession. And yet, as with many answers found too late, the peace he represented was short-lived. Only 3 years after Ivan's birth, Vasily was dead, taken, some say, by a festering abscess, others by the slow-rot court poison, but gone all the same, leaving a toddler with a crown far too large for his head, and a kingdom already beginning to slide into chaos. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, stepped into the role of regent with a calculated grace that belied the danger she now faced. In a time when women wielded power only from behind curtains and through whispered influence, Elena stood visibly at the center of rule, respected by some, resented by many. Her enemies were numerous, her allies fickle, and her position as guardian of the realm constantly under threat. For 5 years, she managed to hold it all together, balancing the weight of nobility, the greed of the boyars, and the fragile sanity of a court built on fragile alliances. But then, just as suddenly as Ivan's father had vanished from his life, his mother too was taken. Felled, many believe, not by sickness, but by poison carefully prepared and ruthlessly administered by those who wished to seize control. And so, by the age of 8, Ivan was alone, not in body, for there were always watchers, always nobles, always servants, but alone in the soul-shaking way that comes when every adult in your world seems either too indifferent to care or too eager to use you. The Kremlin, with its domes and towers and candlelit chapels, should have been a place of safety, but for Ivan, it was more prison than palace. The boyars, those landed nobles who had once sworn oaths of loyalty to his father and mother, now used the young czar as a pawn in their power games, smiling at him in the day, ignoring or humiliating him at night, stealing from the royal treasury, while denying him food, warmth, or kindness. He was a figurehead, a child king with no power and no voice, growing up in shadows where fear and suspicion took root like ivy. And yet Ivan, even as a child, was no fool. He watched, he listened, he learned. Denied love, he turned to books. Denied trust, he turned inward. Denied affection, he studied the mechanics of control. His education was vast of time. He read scripture, histories, chronicles of Rome and Byzantium, the lives of saints, and the fiery warnings of prophets. But it was not the gentle words of Christ that caught his attention. It was a fire, the wrath, the idea that those chosen by God must sometimes become instruments of divine punishment. In the quiet of the palace library, surrounded by ink and parchment, Ivan began to craft a vision of power that was not merciful, but terrible. A power that punished, that ruled through fear, that commanded obedience not through affection but through awe. There are tales, dark, unnerving tales, of how young Ivan, in moments when no one was watching, would hurl animals from the heights of the Kremlin towers, not out of madness, but out of cold curiosity, as though he were testing the laws of nature or mimicking the cruelty he had seen in the faces of those meant to protect him. It was not that Ivan did not understand pain. It was that he had been surrounded by it for so long. It became something natural to him, something expected, something that could be given as easily as it was received. When he was 13, he is said to have ordered his first execution, not in the heat of rage, but with a calm finality that startled even those jaded by court politics. It was as though, from that moment forward, Ivan stopped seeing death as something tragic and began to see it as a tool, a ruler's right, a tsar's weapon. By the time he turned 16, Ivan made history. He did not allow the boyars to crown him as Grand Prince, the title his predecessors had used. Instead, he crowned himself Tsar of all Russia, a term that evoked the Caesars of Rome, that carried with the weight not just of political dominance, but a sacred duty. It was not enough to rule. Ivan would now reign as a monarch divinely chosen, accountable only to God, and feared by all men. The coronation in 1547 was unlike any before it. Ivan wore robes heavy with gold, a crown forged with centuries of symbolism, and accepted the monomachus cap, an ancient relic said to have been passed down from the Byzantine emperors. The ceremony was not just political. It was spiritual theater, meant to show the Russian people, and more importantly, the boyars, that a new kind of ruler had arrived. A ruler not raised by men, but forged in fire, betrayal, and divine prophecy. Yet even with his new title, Ivan remained haunted. That same year, Moscow caught fire, whether by accident or sabotage, no one knows. Thousands died. Entire districts turned to ash. The people whispered of omens, of curses, of divine punishment. And in the smoke, Ivan saw not tragedy, but justification. A sign that his rule must be strong, unrelenting, punishing. If even God could cleanse with flame, so too could the Tsar. This was the true birth of Ivan the Terrible. Not in the palace where he first cried as an infant, but in the lonely halls where he watched his protectors become tormentors, and the fire where he decided that love was a weakness and fear would be his kingdom. Because when you raise a child in silence, feed him with fear, clothe him in suspicion, and teach him that no one can be trusted, not even family, you do not create a man. You create something far more dangerous. You create a Tsar. By the time Ivan forecrowned himself Tsar of all Russia in 1547, the boy who once wandered the stone corridors of the Kremlin half-starved and ignored had vanished. In his place stood a young man cloaked in gold, hands resting on the orb and scepter of Moscow, eyes heavy with calculation, and heart already hardened by betrayal. This moment was not merely ceremonial, it was revolutionary. For the first time in Russian history, a ruler declared himself Tsar, a term pulled from the Latin Caesar, one that echoed with imperial gravitas, divine sanction, and the legacy of ancient empires. Ivan wasn't content to inherit a fractured throne. He was going to reforge it in fire. In the years that followed, Ivan entered a period historians would later call his early reform era, a strange interlude of clarity and ambition before the storm. He was only 17, but he moved quickly, decisively, as if he already knew how little time stability would offer him. And for a moment, the people of Russia saw not a tyrant, but a visionary. He reorganized government administration with methodical precision, seeking to curb the unrelenting power of the boyars who had tormented him in childhood. He formed a council of nobles, the chosen council, they were called, made up of loyal clerics, scholars, and low-ranking nobles who had earned his trust not by birth, but by service. These men, many of them from outside the entrenched aristocracy, helped Ivan streamline the laws, stabilize the treasury, and even attempt an early form of justice reform. For the first time in living memory, the machinery of governance in Muscovy began to run with purpose, not simply greed. He also sought spiritual legitimacy. In 1549, Ivan convened the first national church council in Russian history, known as the Stoglav Synod. Here, he elevated Russian saints, unified church practices, and pushed for the moral purification of clergy. The Tsar's authority, he claimed, was not only political but sacred, a bridge between the earthly and divine. He was no mere ruler. He was, in his own mind, God's instrument. But this renaissance was not without its darkness. Even in these early days, Ivan's insecurities festered beneath the surface. His reforms were less about empowerment and more about centralization. Power gathered tightly in his fists. He trusted few, feared many, and forgave almost no one. Even as he gifted land to loyal followers and offered new laws to the commoners, he watched the boyars like a hawk, waiting, always waiting, for betrayal. It was not a matter of if, but when. And then came Anastasia Romanovna. In 1547, the same year of his coronation, Ivan married the young and gentle noblewoman from the Romanov family. By all accounts, she was not chosen for power, beauty, or politics, but because she calmed him. In a life defined by suspicion and violence, Anastasia became a rare stillness, a presence that soothed the beast forming behind the tsar's eyes. Their marriage, though arranged in form, became deeply personal in substance. She was perhaps the only person Ivan ever truly trusted. For over a decade, while Anastasia stood beside him, Ivan built. He expanded his influence outward, gathering more power into Moscow's orbit. He reformed the army into a more modern, organized force and looked toward conquest. His gaze fell upon Kazan, the capital of the Tatar Khanate, a city that had resisted Moscow's reach for centuries. And in 1552, Ivan struck. The siege of Kazan was a brutal affair. For weeks, Russian forces surrounded the fortified city, cutting off supplies, launching wave after wave of cannon fire, and deploying the full might of Muscovy's military innovation. When the walls finally broke, Ivan entered in triumph. But what followed was not mere occupation. It was annihilation. Thousands were killed. Religious buildings were desecrated. Survivors were forcibly baptized. For Ivan, this was not just a military victory. It was a holy war, a cleansing, a fulfillment of divine mission. He ordered the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow to commemorate the victory, its vivid domes rising like fire from stone, a symbol of power, beauty, and blood. Kazan's fall marked a turning point. With his enemies crumbling and his authority unchallenged, Ivan began to believe not only in his righteousness, but in his invincibility. If he was God's chosen czar, then opposition was not merely political, it was blasphemous. From this seed, paranoia grew. Then, in 1560, everything changed. Anastasia fell ill. It was sudden, strange. Fevers, hallucinations, a decline too quick and cruel. Ivan watched helpless, as the only light in his life dimmed and died, and something inside him cracked. He was certain, utterly convinced, that she had been poisoned, that the boyars, jealous of her influence, had taken her from him as they had taken his mother, his childhood, his trust. Whether true or not, Ivan believed it, and that belief, rooted in grief and festering rage, became the foundation for everything that followed. After her death, Ivan changed. Gone was a reformer. In his place stood a man consumed by fury, suspicion, and the insatiable hunger for control. He withdrew from court for a time, retreating into prayer, fasting, and strange rituals of penance. When he emerged, he was gaunt, intense, and terrifying. In 1564, he did something unthinkable. Ivan wrote 2 letters. One was a resignation, stating that he was abdicating the throne. The other was a scathing indictment of the boyars and the clergy, accusing them of betrayal, corruption, and the murder of his beloved Anastasia. Then he left Moscow, disappearing to the northern town of Alexandrov with a group of loyal guards and servants. The capital descended into chaos. For months, Russia was leaderless, terrified, directionless. The people begged him to return. The clergy pleaded. The boyars panicked. And then, once his power had been proven, Ivan returned, but with conditions. He demanded absolute power, the right to punish treason however he saw fit, the right to bypass all traditional courts, councils, and laws. And so, with the nation on its knees, Ivan established what he called the Oprichnina, a separate realm within Russia, ruled by him alone, staffed by his own private army of black-robed enforcers, unbound by law. This was no longer reform. This was reign through terror. The man who once dreamed of a more just Muscovy had vanished. In his place stood the czar who would fill rivers with blood, silence the nobility with screams, and ride through villages with his horsemen cloaked in death. And so, the transformation was complete. Ivan the Terrible the Grozny, had arrived. When Ivan returned to Moscow under the dark banner of the Oprichnina, he was no longer simply a czar. He had remade himself into something else entirely. Not a ruler, but a wrathful instrument of judgment, cloaked in black and riding at the head of a mounted order that would become infamous across the Russian lands. They called themselves the Oprichniki, and they bore strange symbols: the severed dog's head to sniff out treason, and a broom to sweep it away. They wore black robes like monks, rode black horses like death, and lived by the will of one man, Ivan. The Oprichnina was a state within a state. Ivan carved Russia in two: the Zemshchina, ruled by traditional boyars and governed by old law, and the Oprichnina, his personal domain, stretching across provinces, towns, and cities, ruled directly through fear and fire. Here, he was judge, priest, and executioner. There was no appeal, no court, no second chance, only the Tsar's gaze and his vengeance. He began with the boyars, the same nobles who had sneered at him as a child, who had poisoned his mother, who had, he believed, killed Anastasia. With precise and methodical cruelty, Ivan tore through the aristocracy. He accused entire families of treason, had them dragged from their estates, stripped of titles and lands, tortured in front of weeping children. Their bodies later paraded through towns to remind the people of what defiance meant. In Novgorod, Pskov, and other cities, noble blood soaked the soil. But it did not stop with the boyars. The Oprichniki descended upon Novgorod in 1570, a city Ivan believed was preparing to defect to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Whether there was truth in the rumor mattered little. Ivan had already decided, and his vengeance was total. For 5 horrifying weeks, the Tsar and his men slaughtered thousands. Men were tied in sacks and thrown into the icy Fokhov River. Women were raped and mutilated. Children were burned alive in monasteries. Churches were looted. Clergy were strangled with their own vestments. It is said that Ivan rode to the carnage himself, directing the executions, laughing, weeping, and praying aloud as bodies piled around him. To those who lived, it was not merely a massacre. It was the wrath of a god, or at least a man who believed himself one. No part of society was spared. Merchants, soldiers, peasants, priests, anyone could be accused, anyone could be tortured, and none would be heard once the Oprichniki came knocking. Torture became ritualized. Victims were flayed alive, impaled, boiled, or torn apart by horses. In some cases, Ivan would force families to watch one another suffering, carefully crafting scenes where the mind was broken before the body. He turned execution into performance. And yet, even in this madness, there were moments of eerie clarity. Ivan kept detailed records of his killings. He justified each one with notes, some theological, others personal. To him, this was not cruelty. This was purification. He was cleansing Russia of rot, of betrayal, of godlessness. He was building a new realm atop a graveyard of the old. And perhaps the most infamous moment of all, the one that would come to define him forever, happened not in war, but in his own palace. In 1581, during an argument with his pregnant daughter-in-law, Ivan accused her of being immodest, of dressing improperly. Enraged, he beat her violently, causing her to miscarry. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, rushed to her defense. They screamed. The son, his heir, his reflection, stood up to the Tsar, and in that moment of fury, Ivan struck him with his iron staff. He cracked the boy's skull. Blood poured. His son collapsed. For days, Ivan wept. He screamed at the heavens, tore his robes, kissed a lifeless body, and begged for forgiveness. But it was too late. The heir was dead. The line of succession was shattered. The realm was left to a weak, unfit second son, Fifer, a pious but feeble man who could barely rule his own household, let alone a kingdom. Ivan had destroyed his legacy with his own hands. He was never the same again. The Oprichnina, which had by now worn itself thin through terror and inefficiency, was dissolved soon after. The experiment had burned too hot, and the people, though broken, had begun to retreat into silence and starvation. The economy had withered. The army was weakened. Enemies gathered at the borders. Russia had been cleansed. Yes, but at what cost? Ivan became more reclusive. He wandered the halls of the Kremlin at night, muttering to portraits, speaking to ghosts. He obsessed over astrology, relics, and apocalyptic prophecies. His prayers became longer, his moods darker. He would weep for hours, then lash out in fury, without warning. One moment, he would quote scripture with perfect clarity. The next, he would order a trusted advisor flayed alive for a misunderstood word. To the outside world, he remained terrifying, but to those within his inner circle, he had become unpredictable, a man drowning in his own legend. Even his own body turned against him. Years of mercury treatments, taken to cure his bouts of illness, had twisted his skin, blackened his gums, and corroded his sanity. His bones ached, his hair thinned, his breath stank of rot. He had become a walking symbol of the empire he built, powerful, feared, decaying. And yet, he never stopped ruling. He never relinquished control, until the day he collapsed. But before that, Ivan left Russia permanently scarred. More than 1 million people are believed to have died during his reign. Not all by his hand, but under his rule, his silence, his command. Entire villages erased. Noble houses exterminated. Religious dissenters drowned in their own blood. He restructured Russia into a centralized autocracy. Yes, but one built on trauma, where fear was policy and suffering was law. What began in the cold silence of childhood ended in screams. And still, Ivan believed it was necessary, because in his mind, the world was always against him, because trust once broken can never be mended, because power once tasted must be protected at any cost. And perhaps, most terrifyingly of all, because deep down, Ivan saw himself as righteous. Ivan died as he lived, gripping power tightly, even as it slipped between his fingers. On the evening of March 28, 1584, the Tsar sat down for a game of chess with one of his trusted men. He was in poor health, bloated, pale, and exhausted, but still commanding, still sharp, still clinging to the routines that gave him a sense of control. Then, without warning, he slumped forward. His body collapsed on the floor of the palace, and within moments, Russia's first Tsar was dead. Some whispered it was a stroke. Others, that it was poison, retribution for a life spent in shadows. But the truth, like so much of Ivan's story, dissolved into legend at his funeral. The people wept, and not only in grief, but in relief, confusion, fear. What would Russia be without him? What comes after a reign ruled by terror? Ivan's body was dressed in royal robes, crowned one final time, and laid to rest in the Archangel Cathedral. But his spirit, it seemed, never left. His death left behind a shattered throne. His surviving son, Fifer, was incapable of governing. Weak in mind and will, he ruled only in name. Real power passed to Fifer's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, marking the beginning of a slow descent into instability, a time that would come to be known as a time of troubles, a period of famine, war, false tsars, and foreign invasion. Ivan had centralized Russia. Yes, he had expanded its territory, subdued rivals, and declared the sacred nature of the tsardom. But he had done so with blood and fire, and the scars he left would not heal easily. His reign instilled not just the power of monarchy, but the expectation of fear. He had taught the Russian people that suffering and silence were part of loyalty, and that mercy was weakness. And yet, paradoxically, he was revered by some. Even now, centuries later, Ivan is remembered with ambivalence. To some, he was a brutal tyrant. To others, a necessary hand during a dark and chaotic era. He became a symbol of Russian autocracy, the Tsar who loved God and wielded death. In folklore, in painting, in national memory, he lingers. The boy who had grown up among wolves became one himself, not because he wanted to, but because he believed the world left him no other choice. As the echoes of Ivan's reign fade into the silence of cold cathedrals and burned villages, another shadow stirs. This time in the forest of Wallachia, where impaled bodies line the roads like warnings carved into flesh. If Ivan ruled by fear, Vlad the Impaler made fear an art form, a prince exiled, a warrior returned, and a man who inspired the myth of Dracula, not through fantasy, but through cruelty so real it chilled even seasoned soldiers. Our next step takes us into the blood-soaked land of spikes and smoke, where mercy died long before the sun ever rose. Vlad the Impaler. Somewhere beyond the forests of Transylvania, where the mist clings low to ground and the trees grow tall and quiet. There once lived a man whose cruelty carved itself into legend. They called him Vlad the Impaler. A prince, a prisoner, a warrior, and perhaps something more. To his enemies, he was a monster. To his people, a protector. But history remembers him best for the forests he built, not from trees, but from bodies. Tonight, we step into those woods, where the wind does not howl, but whispers. And every whisper tells a story of Vlad. In a region shrouded by mist and legend, nestled between the Carpathian Mountains and dense black forests, where the wind whistled like a whispering ghost, and the earth seemed to remember every drop of blood it had swallowed, a child was born, not into innocence, but into inheritance, and not into peace, but into a waiting war. His name was Vlad, second son of Vlad II Dracul, and from the moment he drew breath in the cold stone walls of Transylvanian fortress in the year 1431, his life was tied, by blood, oath, and betrayal, to a kingdom where survival was earned, not given. The land of Wallachia, his father's domain, was a place where rulers reigned by sword more than by law, where loyalty was often a coin easily bought and swiftly discarded, and where the throne itself was not so much a symbol of stability as it was a seat barely balanced above a pit of knives. In such a land, children were not raised for joy or softness. They were raised like weapons, shaped, honed, and sharpened with care. And Vlad, as a boy, understood far earlier than most that being born a prince meant little without the means to keep one's head. His father, Vlad II, a man of ambition and calculation, had aligned himself with the powerful Christian knights of the Order of the Dragon, an elite brotherhood sworn to resist the encroaching Muslim empire, the Ottomans. It was this allegiance that earned him the name Dracul, the Dragon. But among the peasants and whispering villagers of Wallachia, the name took on a darker sound. Dracul, in their tongue, could just as easily mean the devil. And so, his son would carry the name Dracula. Not yet the vampire of nightmares, but the child of a dragon or perhaps a devil. Vlad's early childhood, such as it was, would have passed in cold halls and damp shadows, within fortified castles where plots were spoken through locked doors, and mercy was rarely a word uttered with sincerity. He had two brothers, Mircea, the favorite elder, and Radu, the younger, gentler soul whose charm would one day prove to be both his strength and his fate. The three boys, though bound by blood, would grow up in a world that taught them again and again that blood could betray just as easily as it could unite. Then came the decision, a political maneuver that would forever alter the trajectory of Vlad's life. In 1442, when Vlad was around 11 years old, his father, caught in the tightening vice between the powerful Hungarian kingdom and the surging force of the Ottoman Empire, chose to bargain for his reign and his kingdom's fragile autonomy, not with gold, nor with land, but with the lives of his own sons. As a sign of loyalty and submission to Sultan Murad II, Vlad and Radu were handed over as hostages to the Ottoman court, taken from their homeland, their mother, and what little comfort they had ever known, and cast into a foreign palace of marble, incense, and silence. In the city of Edirne, within the gilded walls of the Ottoman court, the two Wallachian boys became symbols, living, breathing guarantees of their father's obedience. But they were also pupils. For the Ottomans, hostage-taking was not merely punishment. It was a method of control and transformation. The boys were given tutors, instructed in science, mathematics, philosophy, languages, and Islamic theology. They learned to ride, to fight, to debate. But every lesson came with a quiet threat. If your father breaks faith, you will die. For Radu, gentle and impressionable, life in Edirne slowly became bearable. He adapted, softened, even thrived, and in time he would befriend the Sultan's own son, the future Mehmed the Conqueror, and convert to Islam, earning a favored place in the court. But Vlad was different. From the beginning, he resisted. He resisted their language, their customs, their prayers, their kindness. His soul seemed unable to bend. And so he was beaten, humiliated, left alone for long stretches with only his thoughts, his hatred, and a quiet memory of home twisted by exile. But Vlad watched. He observed the structure of the Ottoman court with the cold curiosity of a future ruler. He paid attention to how fear functioned, not as chaos, but as architecture, He saw how punishments were administered publicly, how impalement was used not simply to kill, but to speak. He memorized the cadence of executions, the slow rhythms of bureaucracy laced with cruelty. He began to understand fear was not madness. It was policy. It was control. And in those years of captivity, something within him calcified. While Radu absorbed the perfume of Ottoman splendor, Vlad inhaled the smoke of his own anger and used it to forge a vision of power that would one day turn forests into cemeteries. Then, as suddenly as they had been taken, Vlad was released. The political tide shifted again. His father had been murdered by rival nobles, his brother Mircea buried alive, and the throne of Wallachia had once again become a crown no one could hold without drawing blood to keep it. The Ottomans saw an opportunity. Vlad, now a teenager, educated, hardened, and angry, was sent back with their backing to claim the throne. But Wallachia was not waiting with open arms. The boy returned to a homeland that had forgotten him. The boyars, the landowning nobles, sneered behind their silks and sharpened daggers. Foreign powers played their own games. And Vlad, still young, still unsure, managed only a fleeting grasp of power before being driven out once more, exiled, humiliated, lost in a familiar world that no longer felt like home. He wandered. He survived. He plotted. Over the next several years, Vlad transformed himself in silence, away from the throne he knew would one day be his. He did not plead for alliances. He demanded them. He did not ask for legitimacy. He forged it through brutality. He gathered support not by promises of peace, but by the promise of vengeance. Vengeance against those who betrayed his family, those who broke the realm, and those who believed they could rule without fearing him. By the time he returned to Wallachia in 1456, he was no longer a lost prince. He was a blade, unsheathed, and with him, he carried not the memory of pain, but the blueprint of it. When Vlad returned to Wallachia in the year 1456, after years of wandering through hostile courts, sleeping in borrowed beds, and sharpening his vision like a blade against the grindstone of exile, he did not return as a child of sorrow or a prince of diplomacy, but as something harder, colder, and more deliberate. A man who had watched the world from beneath it, and now sought to remake it from above. His journey back to the throne was not marked by a triumphant parade or songs sung in candlelight, but by the quiet, lethal steps of a man who no longer believed in kindness, who trusted no one but the silence of his own mind, and who had come to understand in a land like Wallachia, power did not flow from bloodlines. It bled from open throats. Supported loosely by Hungarian nobles who found him useful and perhaps even expendable, Vlad seized a moment, rallying whatever forces he could muster and striking at the weakened core of his homeland like a hawk descending on a snake that had grown too slow to coil. His rival at the time, Vladislav II, had worn the crown with little distinction. Caught between factions, never feared and rarely loved, and when Vlad challenged him, there was no grand battle recorded, no sprawling siege. It was fast, ruthless, efficient. Vladislav was killed in combat, and with his death, Vlad Dracula became voivode of Wallachia, taking the throne not through inheritance, not by birthright, but by blade. What followed was not a reign in conventional sense, but a restructuring of reality, a deliberate, surgical dismantling of the old nobility. The treacherous boyars who had poisoned his father, buried his brother alive, and treated the throne like a game of dice played in dark corners. Vlad summoned them under the guise of tradition, inviting them to a feast in Targovus, his new seat of power. The boyars, greedy for favor and unaware, or perhaps unwilling to believe, that the boy they once discarded had returned with memory like steel, arrived in fine clothes, heavy with perfume and lies. And then he turned on them, the younger and stronger among them. He did not kill, not at first. Instead, he forced them to march, day and night, without rest or reason, until their shoes wore the leather threads and their legs swelled with blood. Those who survived were dragged to mountains and forced to build Poenry Castle, stone by stone, brick by brick, under whip and starvation, under the sharp, watching gaze of the man who would sleep in the halls their suffering raised. The older boyars, the ones whose hands still smelled faintly of the grave they had dug for Vlad's father, he simply impaled. And from that moment forward, fear became a seal, more binding than wax, or ink more certain than law. Vlad ruled not through policy or persuasion, but through an ever-present and very real threat. Justice, as he defined it, was swift and brutal. Thieves were impaled publicly. Adulterers disemboweled. Liars had their tongues removed. One legend tells of a golden cup placed in the center of a public square in Targovist, untouched for years, because no one dared steal under Vlad's watch. But this was not madness, not yet. This was ordered by terror, a system he believed necessary for a land where chaos had reigned longer than memory. Wallachia had always been the cracked tooth between Hungary and the Ottomans, pushed, pulled, invaded, and forgotten. Vlad sought not just to rule it, but to discipline it, to force it into unity beneath his hand. Yet his greatest challenge was not within his borders, but beyond them. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, once his captor, now his enemy, looked northward. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had once walked beside Radu in Edirne's gardens, had grown into a conqueror who had taken Constantinople and now ruled from its ashes. He expected Vlad, a former hostage, to remain obedient, a vassal prince, quietly submitting tribute, offering troops, and bending the knee when summoned. But Vlad did not bend. In 1461, when Ottoman envoys arrived to collect the customary tribute and demanded obeisance, Vlad responded not with gold or diplomacy, but with steel. He had them captured, impaled on stakes, and sent a message not just to the Sultan, but to the world. Wallachia would not be ruled by foreign hands. And when Mehmed responded, marching north with an army set in number in the tens of thousands, Vlad did not meet him on an open field. Instead, he waged a war of shadows, burning his own villages, poisoning wells, cutting down forests, and turning the land itself into a weapon. He led night raids, striking at the heart of Ottoman camps under moonlight, vanishing before dawn like smoke. His forces were smaller, outnumbered, but they were fighting with rage and memory, not just weapons. And then came the moment that would burn Vlad into legend. As Mehmed's forces approached Targovist, weary and wary from days of guerrilla warfare, they crested a hill and found themselves face to face with horror. An entire forest of stakes, some 20,000, perhaps more, rose from the earth like a field of bones. Atop each, a corpse, Ottoman soldiers, merchants, nobles, bodies twisted, rotting, groaning in the sun, some still clinging to a flicker of life. The air was thick with death, the ground soaked with rot, the crows fat and bold. The Sultan, for all his strength, paused. Even he, who had conquered Constantinople, was shaken. He saw not just a military obstacle, but a psychological chasm, a man who would burn his own kingdom to the ground before letting it fall into enemy hands. And so, Mehmed turned back, not because he'd been defeated in battle, but because he had stared into madness and found it staring back. Vlad, for a time, had won. He ruled with impunity, cutting down rivals, terrifying the nobility, and reinforcing his power through public horror. His court became a place of whispers, his roads lined with reminders. But in every moment of strength, there lived the seed of collapse. Radu, his own brother, now known as Radu the Handsome, beloved of the Ottomans and their political darling, returned not as a hostage, but as a conqueror, leading Ottoman forces against a brother who had once clung to his side. And with the tides of war shifting, with betrayal blooming again like blood through linen, Vlad was eventually driven from his throne, captured and imprisoned, first by enemies, then by so-called allies. But that is a story for another night, because a man who turned fear into a weapon, who built a kingdom on bodies and ruled through silence, would not vanish so easily. Not Vlad, not Dracula. There are rulers who kill for power, and then there are those who make power from killing. Vlad Dracula, voivode of Wallachia, did not simply use fear. He engineered it. He built it, brick by brick, corpse by corpse, turning his domain into a theater of suffering where every stake was a message, every scream a decree, and every town square a reminder that life under his rule meant obedience or spectacle. To the people of Wallachia, especially the peasants, Vlad was both savior and shadow. He defended them from Ottoman invasion, purged corrupt nobles, and enforced brutal justice that often favored the poor. But the price was a kingdom soaked in dread. It began with order. Yes, his laws punished theft, treason, adultery, and bribery with swift and horrific finality. But soon, justice blurred into obsession and then into bloodlust. His most infamous punishment, impalement, was not a passing cruelty, not a tool used in secret, but a practice elevated to ritual. Vlad perfected the method. A wooden or iron stake, smooth and greased, was driven not through the chest, but up through the body, often via the rectum or vagina, carefully avoiding vital organs so that the victim would not die quickly. Death could take hours, sometimes even days, as the body slowly slid downward by its own weight. The stakes were tall, angled, and sharpened just so, creating an eerie silhouette against the sky, a forest of the damned, groaning in the wind. He didn't hide these scenes. On the contrary, he invited people to look. One account tells of hundreds of Saxon merchants, accused of dishonesty and deceit, impaled outside the city walls. But even more chilling is the story of how he hosted a banquet, not within the safety of his palace, but among the dying. In the midst of this impalement field, with the smell of blood and rot thick in the air, Vlad is said to have dined calmly, dipping his bread in the blood of his enemies, laughing as the impaled twitched around him, whether symbolic or literal. The tale captured the imagination of Europe. Feeding a legend that would never die, he applied the same cruelty to his own people. In one instance, Vlad invited all the sick, poor, and disabled from the region to a great feast. He fed them generously, gave them wine, and when the night was deep and their bellies full, he ordered the building locked and burned to the ground. All of them died. Why? Because he claimed he did not want poverty or illness in his land. He sought a kingdom that was strong, clean, and pure, even if he had to burn the weak from it. His paranoia grew over time. He believed everyone could be a spy. No one was truly safe, not foreigners, not monks, not women, not even lovers. In another tale, a woman whose husband failed to wear clean clothes was disemboweled, and her body was displayed in the market as a lesson in domestic discipline. A nobleman who disrespected the throne had his hat nailed to his skull, so he'd never forget to remove it again. Every punishment carried symbolism. Every act of violence was personal. But it was during his war with the Saxon cities of Transylvania that Vlad unleashed his most calculated horrors. These German-speaking merchant towns, particularly Brasov, had resisted his control, favored his rivals, and supported boyars he had sworn to destroy. Vlad responded with an unrelenting campaign of devastation. He invaded the region, burning villages, leveling churches, and impaling entire populations. Women, children, priests, it didn't matter. He wrote in letters to his allies how he left rows of corpses in his wake, and proudly described how their bodies blackened in the sun as ravens feasted and wolves fattened. These were not confessions of a reluctant ruler. They were boasts, proof of his effectiveness, his resolve, his dominance. But even as Europe shuddered at the stories, the Ottoman Empire remained his greatest threat. After Mehmed the Conqueror's failed invasion, Vlad became more than a nuisance to the Sultan. He became an embarrassment, and in response, the Ottomans sent Radu, Vlad's own brother, to oust him from power. Radu, now a prince of Islam and favored the Sultan, marched into Wallachia with Ottoman support. But rather than fight with terror, Radu fought with diplomacy. He promised peace. He offered forgiveness. Many Wallachians, exhausted by Vlad's rule, chose the familiar softness of Radu over the iron grip of his brother. And so, Vlad was overthrown. But here, the story becomes even stranger. He fled to Hungary, where he was imprisoned by Matthias Corvinus, the very king he once served. And while he sat in a Hungarian prison for over a decade, Europe devoured his legend. German printers spread tales of Vlad's sadism across the continent. Stories of men boiled alive, of women skinned for lies, of entire villages staked like gardens. Whether true or not, it hardly mattered. Vlad the man had become Vlad the myth, the foundation for a fear that no battlefield could match. And yet, despite the terror, despite the exile, he returned. In 1476, with Hungarian backing, Vlad reclaimed his throne for a brief, final reign. But his enemies were waiting. Within months, he was killed, ambushed in battle, his head severed and sent to the Sultan in Constantinople, where it was said to be displayed above the city gates as proof that the Impaler was dead at last. But was he? Because long after his body rotted, the world still remembered the man who turned forests into warnings. And though his enemies celebrated his death, his methods remained, etched into the memory of a people who had learned that in Wallachia, justice once wore a crown and carried a stake. In the final month of his life, Vlad Dracula stood once more where he had stood so many times before, between the mountains and the fire, between exile and power, between the blade and the throne. After years in chains and whispers, after a long imprisonment in hungry stone towers, he returned to Wallachia in 1476 not as a young man burning with vengeance, but as an older warrior, worn thin by time, betrayal, and ghosts that never stopped speaking. He reclaimed his title for mere weeks. The kingdom he returned to was not the one he had tried to control. The boyars, once silenced by fear, had found their voices again under his brother Radu. The Ottomans still watched from the south, unwilling to forget the forest of the dead. The peasants, once protected by Vlad's unrelenting punishment of nobles and thieves, had grown weary of blood, and their silence had shifted into something colder, distant, exhausted fear. And so, not long after his return, he died. The details are lost in haze. Some say it was an ambush, a betrayal by his own men. Others claim it was a battlefield beheading by Ottoman mercenaries. Regardless, one truth remains. His body was found without his head, and that head, so often filled with wrath and calculation, was sent to the Sultan, spiked high above the gates of Constantinople, as a final victory over the man who had once made empires tremble. But Vlad was not forgotten. He left no lasting dynasty, no golden age of prosperity, no reforms etched in marble, but he left something else, a legacy carved in fear. Stories of his rule spread across Europe faster than any army, transformed by rumor, retelling, and horror. Pamphlets printed in German lands told tales of vampires and impaled corpses, of blood-soaked feasts and punishments too gruesome to comprehend. Some of it was true, much of it was exaggerated, but none of it was ignored. He became myth, he became monster, he became Dracula. And though Bram Stoker would reinvent that name centuries later, twisting into a creature of fiction, the seed was always Vlad, the real one, the one who ruled not from a coffin but from a throne of sharpened stakes, the one whose name still echoes through Carpathian valleys and beneath the stone arches of ruined castles. His legacy is not simple. To some, he was a national hero, a man who defended Christian Europe from the Ottoman tide, who punished corrupt, who brought brutal justice to a broken land. To others, he was the devil himself, a sadist, a tyrant, a man who turned cruelty into a crown. But in the end, perhaps he was something stranger still, a man who, when handed over as a hostage boy, returned to the world not begging for mercy, but determined to never need it again. As the dust settles over the forest of Wallachia and the last screams from the stakes fade into silence, we turn our gaze westward to the cold, candlelit halls of the castle in the Kingdom of Hungary, where another shadow moves behind velvet curtains. She is not a warrior. She does not ride into battle, but her cruelty, quiet, elegant, and merciless, would leave hundreds of girls broken and buried. They called her the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Bathory. And if Vlad taught the world to fear pain, Elizabeth would teach it to fear beauty. Elizabeth Bathory. In a castle high upon a lonely hill, where the wind whispers through iron gates and time hangs heavy in the air, there lived a woman of great wealth, noble birth, and unspeakable darkness. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and beneath her silks and powdered skin, history says there beat a heart obsessed with youth, with power, and with the cold silence of death. They say she bathed in blood, counted her victims by the hundreds, and smiled as they screamed. But who was she really? A monster in lace? Or something far more human, and far more terrifying? Before the screams, before the cold stones of Cactus Castle drank the blood of vanished girls, and long before her name became a whispered curse across Europe, Elizabeth Bathory was simply a child, born not into cruelty, but into power, and not into isolation, but into a world so far above others that their lives became distant, ornamental, disposable. She was born in 1560, into the noble Bathory family, one of the oldest and most powerful dynasties in Hungary, with roots that tangled deep to the soil of Transylvania and stretched into royal courts across the continent. Her father, Barois van Bathory, was a high-ranking warlord. Her mother, Anna Bathory, came from the same bloodline, making Elizabeth a product of a tightly wound, intermarried lineage that valued prestige over affection and legacy over love. From the very beginning, Elizabeth's world was one of privilege, but not softness. She grew up in X Castle, a dark and imposing structure surrounded by marshlands, where the servants moved like shadows, and the walls felt closer to fortress than home. As a child, she spoke Hungarian, Latin, and German, and read fluently before most girls her age had even learned to sit still. She was precocious, brilliant, and perhaps, even as a girl, a little too still, a little too quiet, a little too fond of watching others suffer. It is said that she once witnessed a thief being sewn alive into the stomach of a dead horse, a punishment so gruesome it bordered on ritual. Where others look away, Elizabeth watched, eyes wide, face unreadable. There are whispers, just whispers, that she smiled. She suffered from fits, perhaps seizures, perhaps something darker. Her moods were said to swing like blades. Her laughter was sharp, but rare, and in a world where noble children were raised by wet nurses and beaten for blemishes, cruelty did not stand out. It was a norm. Violence was everywhere. Mercy was weakness. And young Elizabeth learned her place not through kindness, but through control. By the age of 10, she was already engaged, not to a boy of similar age, but to a powerful soldier, Ferenc Nadasdy, a future warlord known as the Black Knight of Hungary. Their marriage was political, a bond between two dynasties, but in time, it would become a partnership in darkness. Ferenc was rarely home, busy waging brutal campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. He sent letters back describing prisoners impaled, flayed, and burned. And when he returned, he brought with him instruments of torture, toys, some say, for his wife. But even before they were wed, Elizabeth had already seen the world's ugliest side. At age 13, it's rumored she became pregnant by a servant, an act considered not just scandalous, but humiliating to her family. The servant boy was captured, castrated, and thrown to the dogs. The child, if it ever truly existed, vanished into silence. Elizabeth was sent away for a time, hidden in the countryside, where the shame could cool and her future remain intact. She returned changed. By the time she married Ferenc in 1575, the wedding was the grandest in living memory. For 1,500 guests, noble blood from across Europe, gold and silver thrown into the air like confetti. As part of her dowry, she received Cactus Castle, a looming structure perched atop a cliff in what is now Slovakia, surrounded by thick forests and deep cellars. It would become her home, and eventually her prison. Ferenc, for all his violence, was rarely cruel to Elizabeth. In fact, it said he taught her, patiently, purposefully, how to discipline the staff. He showed her how to drive pins beneath fingernails, how to lash a servant without drawing blood, how to punish without consequence. And Elizabeth, now a lady of the castle, with an entire staff at her command and no one above her but absent men, began to experiment. At first, it was small, a missing hairpin, a crooked seam, a spilled goblet of wine. She would slap, then hit, then burn, then cut. No one questioned her. No one dared, because she was not merely a wife. She was noble blood, and noble blood did not stain easily. When Ferenc died in 1604, something in Elizabeth shifted. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was liberation. No longer tethered by her husband's shadow, she was now the most powerful woman in the region, in full control of her estate, her wealth, and her desires. And those desires, long hidden, long restrained behind etiquette and expectation, began to slip through the cracks. The whispers grew louder. Girls, mostly peasant girls, began to disappear, brought to the castle under the promise of work or education, only to vanish behind stone doors. Servants carried buckets of something thick and dark down winding staircases. Strange cries echoed through the lower halls. And Elizabeth, ever poised, ever elegant, continued to host dinners, appear in court, and send letters to nobles, her handwriting perfect even as her hands were still warm with blood. It was said that she beat a maid so viciously that blood splattered across her skin, and when she wiped away, she believed, truly believed, that her flesh looked younger, smoother, glowing. Whether this was madness, myth, or self-delusion is still debated. But what is clear is that after that moment, The killings escalated. She began to chase youth not with medicine or prayer, but with murder. And behind the heavy doors of Cactus Castle, a ritual was born. But that, dear listener, is a chapter we will open next. After the death of Ferenc Nadesti in 1604, the once young countess who had grown up among swords and whispers stood alone, no longer a nobleman's wife, no longer constrained by anyone's rule but her own. Elizabeth Bathory was now the undisputed mistress of Cactus. And with her husband gone, the delicate threads that had once tethered her to civility began to unravel. At first, the change was subtle. She took on more responsibilities, managed the estates with cold precision, and maintained her outward role as a lady of great wealth and noble grace. She handled lawsuits, collected taxes, and even engaged in small acts of charity for show, donating grain during hard winters, paying priests to perform mass, ensuring her name echoed to the countryside not only as a woman of fear, but of fortune. But beneath that polished surface, the castle was darkening. Ferenc had once taught her cruelty like a craft, a discipline to be wielded with precision and pride. But in his absence, Elizabeth no longer followed any blueprint. She made her own rules now, and the punishments that once served as warnings or tools of correction grew into rituals, acts that lingered too long, involved too much blood, and left too little the girl who had once watched a thief die inside a horse without blinking. With a small circle of servants and accomplices, including her nurse, her maids, a deformed boy, and an alleged witch, Elizabeth began to build a private empire of torment inside the thick stone walls of Cactus. She selected young girls, mostly peasants from nearby villages, with promises of domestic work or noble education. They would enter the gates smiling, barefoot and hopeful, clutching the hands of worried mothers. They would not be seen again. Elizabeth ruled over them like a queen of shadows. She was methodical, never rushing, never impulsive. She believed in planning, in presentation. She kept records, sometimes vague, sometimes chillingly detailed. And as the years passed, the castle absorbed them. Hundreds of girls, their names unrecorded, their voices lost behind centuries of stone. The punishments, if they could still be called that, became increasingly elaborate, increasingly theatrical. Girls were tied naked in winter snow and doused in cold water, left to freeze while Elizabeth sipped warm wine by a roaring fire. Others were stripped and whipped until their skin peeled or stabbed with needles, beneath the nails, into the tongue, through the genitals, as Elizabeth looked on with calm, calculated interest. Some were locked in cages suspended from ceilings, designed to restrict all movement but shivering. Some were sliced open, bit by bit, to test how much pain could be endured before the soul gave out. There are stories of her smearing blood on her face, of biting flesh from the cheeks of young girls, of forcing servants to eat parts of themselves or each other. Whether all these accounts are true remains uncertain, but what is clear is this: Elizabeth no longer saw people as people. They were flesh, function, and, above all, fuel. Her obsession with youth deepened into something ritualistic. It was no longer enough to beat or kill. She believed, or convinced herself to believe, that blood held power, that the vitality of the young could transfer into her own decaying skin. She studied mirrors more closely, examined wrinkles with trembling hands, and began to bathe in blood. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. She would order a servant to be cut open, the blood collected warm in basins, and then poured into a bath while the body was still twitching on the floor. She would lie there, eyes half closed, humming to herself, convinced that her beauty was returning. And when it wasn't, when age still crept across her face, she blamed the girls. Not pure enough, not innocent enough. Bring me another. Her network expanded. The castle became a machine. Her assistants traveled further to find girls, sometimes abducting them, sometimes bribing desperate families with coin or protection. Even as rumors spread, fear kept the doors closed. Who would accuse a noble woman? Who would believe a peasant? But Elizabeth did not stop. She could not. The more she bathed, the more she bled others dry, the more she sought control over time itself. Her gowns grew darker, her servants thinner, her eyes sharper. She stopped attending church. She avoided windows and daylight. She withdrew deeper and deeper into the shadows she had made, until Cactus was not a home, but temple of cruelty, where youth died screaming and blood ran like rainwater through hidden channels beneath the floors. And still, she believed she was above consequence, because in her mind, she was noble, she was chosen. She had built an empire where pain was power, where fear was a form of elegance, and where no one, not kings, not priests, not even God, could take what she had made. But power feeds on silence, and silence cannot last forever. The peasants whispered louder. Priests stopped turning blind eyes. Families began to ask, "Where are our daughters?" And the name Bathory, once gilded with respect, began to crack, syllable by syllable, like something rotting beneath polished marble. She had killed too many. She had gone too far. And someone was finally listening. By the time Elizabeth Bathory stood at the height of her power, wealthy beyond reckoning, widowed but untouchable, alone in a castle perched like a crown on the cliffs above the forests of Slovakia, there was no longer a need for masks or performances or the fragile pageantry and nobility that once held her behind the veil of social grace. Instead, what emerged in the stillness of her later years was something colder, something slower, something that had grown quietly over decades like sickness beneath her skin. The belief that pain could be not just a punishment or a means of control, but a source of transformation. She had always been severe, always exacting, always prone to moods that shifted like weather in the Carpathians. Cold one moment, storming the next, but with her husband long buried and her power unchallenged, the things she once only imagined in silence she now enacted in stone, and what began as discipline turned into cruelty, and what began as cruelty turned into ritual, until the act of hurting others was no longer about correction or justice or social order, but about possessing something from within them, extracting it, consuming it, not metaphorically, but literally. At first, it was peasant girls, nameless, voiceless, faceless girls from villages so small they barely existed on any map, brought to the castle under the guise of servitude or education, handed over by their families who believed, foolishly and desperately, that their daughters would learn how to sew or how to serve tea or how to marry well, but who instead vanished into corridors of stone, never to be seen again, save for the distant scent of burning bone that drifted sometimes down into the valley when the wind was high and the staff carried buckets filled with something thick and read through the garden paths at dusk. It is said, and perhaps there is truth to it, that Elizabeth never raised her voice, never lost her temper the way common nobles did. Her punishments were not wild, not emotional, but quiet and calculated, the way a butcher chooses where to cut, so as not to waste good meat. A servant who spilled wine might be struck, yes, but not just with the palm of a hand. Elizabeth might instead insert sewing needles beneath her fingernails, one by one, slowly, carefully, making the girl watch, making her hold her breath, making her understand that her pain was not accidental, but artful. Other girls were stripped naked and beaten until the skin peeled from their backs, not as punishment, but as a test, to see how long the flesh could endure before it broke. And still others were locked in cages, small, cramped cages suspended from beams in the castle's vaulted chambers, where they could not sit, could not stand, could only hang, trembling, while Elizabeth observed their suffering like a scholar reading scripture. She did not always kill them, at least not immediately. Sometimes, the girls were kept alive for days, even weeks, as their wounds festered and their minds unraveled. They were fed just enough to survive, just enough to remain useful. Their blood was precious. Their screams, it seemed, were part of the process. There are whispers, more than whispers, that Elizabeth believed blood, especially virgin blood, contained some essential property, some spiritual vitality that could be harnessed if one bathed in it, or drank it, or rubbed it into the skin while the heart was still beating. She believed that youth was not merely a thing lost with time, but a substance, and that it could be stolen. And so she stole it. The methods became more elaborate as her confidence grew. In winter, she would have a girl dragged into the courtyard, stripped of clothing, tied to a post, and doused with freezing water until her skin turned blue and her lips cracked. And there she would remain, screaming in the snow, until she froze like a statue beneath the moon. In the kitchens, girls were sometimes burned, not with fire, but with irons heated until they glowed red, applied to thighs, to stomachs, to the insides of arms, not as punishment, but as exploration. In one instance, a servant girl's mouth was sewn shut with silk thread after speaking out of turn, and she was left like that for days, unable to eat, her lips infected, her jaw trembling, until her body failed and her silence became eternal. Eventually, the bodies became too many to hide. At first, they were buried in the castle gardens, under the cover of night, or taken into the woods by servants loyal enough, or terrified enough to obey. But as the years passed and Elizabeth's thirst grew deeper and her delusion stronger, discretion faded. Girls began dying more frequently, sometimes multiple in a week, and their corpses were stacked like broken dolls behind cellar walls or dragged into hidden chambers beneath the chapel floor, where the air was already heavy with the smell of old prayers and fresh rot. And still, she wanted more. It was not enough to take from the poor. Now she demanded girls of noble blood, girls from good families, girls who had names and cousins and uncles who served in court. She believed their blood to be more potent, more refined, more effective. And it was this escalation, not the body count, that brought her downfall. Because while peasant daughters could vanish in silence, noble girls could not. Families began asking questions. Priests grew uneasy. Letters were sent, first to local authorities, then to the crown. And yet, Elizabeth remained calm. She continued her routines, her social visits, her careful correspondence. She held court in her gown of black velvet, while girls bled beneath her feet. She sent gifts to bishops while bones cracked in floors below. In her mind, she was doing nothing wrong. She was maintaining her beauty. She was perfecting herself. She was taking what the world had never denied men: the right to power, the right to control, the right to last. But the walls were closing in. And so, on a winter night in 1610, under orders from King Matthias II, a small company of men led by Georgi Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, arrived at the castle with warrants in hand and swords drawn. They did not knock. They forced their way in. And what they found, according to accounts written in horror and disbelief, was a vision of hell. Bodies twisted on wooden frames, girls chained to the walls, a basin filled with blood still warm, the stench so overwhelming that even the hardened soldiers turned their faces away. Some girls were dead. Some were barely breathing. One had no tongue. Another had no eyes. And in the midst of it all, composed, silent, untouched, stood Elizabeth, her hands folded in front of her gown perfectly clean, her expression unreadable. She did not flee. She did not speak. She simply stared. In the days that followed the raid on Cactus Castle, the halls that once echoed with muffled cries and footsteps dragging across stone felt eerily quiet, as if the walls themselves were relieved to no longer absorb so much pain. And yet even in that silence, something remained, a coldness, a presence, a history that could not be unmade by sunlight or confession. The women who had assisted Elizabeth, her loyal servants, her nurse, her accomplices, were arrested, tortured, and executed, their bodies hung or burned or broken, while their mistress, the one who orchestrated it all, who gave the orders, who bathed in the aftermath, was never tried, because she was nobility, because she was a Bathory, because she was powerful enough to destroy the truth, even in chains. Instead of public judgment, she was sealed away, quite literally, inside her own castle, a suite of rooms bricked shut, with only a small slot left to pass food and water, where no one could visit, no one could hear her voice, and no one could see what became of her in those final, for long years. They say she spoke to herself often, that she would whisper prayers or nonsense or names long dead, pacing back and forth across the stone in total darkness. Some say she laughed. Some say she cried. Others say she grew still, stopped speaking altogether, and began to rot from the inside like the bodies she left behind. On a quiet August night in 1614, a guard peered through the food slot and found her lying on the floor, perfectly still, her hands curled at her chest, her eyes half open, as if surprised to find herself dying. She was 54 years old. Her death was never publicly mourned. There was no ceremony, no noble procession, only silence and the hurried scratching of quills as authorities tried to erase her name from the records, as if that could cleanse the air of what she had done. But the dead are not so easily forgotten, especially not when there are so many of them. The official records list around 80 confirmed victims, but the estimates range into the hundreds. Some say over 600 girls, though no number can fully capture what she took or the fear she left behind. Villages remembered. Mothers remembered. The blood-soaked stones remembered. In time, her name resurfaced, not as a countess, but as a legend. She became the Blood Countess, the woman who bathed in the blood of virgins, who lived in shadows, who hunted innocence for youth. Whether every detail was true no longer mattered. The myth had grown stronger than the woman. Her legacy was no longer her wealth, her power, her nobility. It was her hunger. And long after her body turned to dust, her story remained. Whisper where the forests are thickest and where the candles burn low. As the last echoes of the Blood Countess fade into the cold soil of Hungary, we leave behind the quiet cruelty of noble shadows and step into a far harsher flame. One not hidden but public, not whispered, but preached. In 15th century Spain, fear wore robes and carried crosses. It spoke the language of salvation and smelled of smoke. His name was Tomás de Torquemada, a man who did not kill for pleasure or beauty, but for purity. And under his rule, faith became a weapon, and mercy was burned at the stake. Next, we enter the Inquisition. Tomás de Torquemada. In a world cloaked in incense and prayer, where the echo of Latin hymns drifted through stone cathedrals, a darker rhythm began to rise, measured not in beats, but in screams. His name was Tomás de Torquemada, and though he wore the robes of a servant god, he became something else entirely. Behind the pulpit, he spoke of purity. Behind closed doors, he ordered torture to cleanse the soul. He broke the body, and in Spain, during the height of fear and fanaticism, his voice carried farther than any king. Tonight, we begin with a whisper and end in flame. Long before his name would be etched into history with the taste of smoke and the sound of screams, long before inquisitors roamed Spain's cobbled streets with crosses in one hand and verdicts in the other, long before the bonfires crackled beneath wooden platforms and heretics wept prayers through broken teeth, there was a boy named Tomás, born into a world that was changing. Quietly at first, then with fire. He entered life in the city of Valladolid, somewhere around the year 1420, born into a family of conversos and minor nobility, people who once may have traced their lineage to Jewish roots, but who, over generations, became Christian in both name and practice. That detail, quiet, possibly buried, possibly whispered only in kitchens or behind chapel walls, would cast a long and complicated shadow over the man he would become. But at the time, it was only blood. And in Tomás's world, blood alone was never enough. From a young age, he was not drawn to play, to laughter, to the games of boys in the market squares or the bravado of swordplay in the alleyways behind the baker's stalls. No, Tomás was a child of silence and of rhythm. He was the kind of child who stared too long at the candles flickering on altars, who memorized entire pages of scripture not for praise, but for the comfort it brought, the structure, the commandment, the certainty. While others dreamed of land or gold or glory, Tomás sought something different. Order, not just of the body, but of the soul. And in a world fractured by politics, religion, and war, a world where Christians, Jews, and Muslims live side by side, often uneasily, sometimes in conflict, but always under the same sun, Tomás began to see division not as a tragedy, but as a problem to be solved. He studied the lives of the saints with the intensity of a boy already preparing for judgment. He read the Old Testament and saw obedience. He read the New and saw salvation. But he looked around his world and saw neither. Instead, he saw chaos cloaked in tolerance, cities where mosques rang beside churches, where old rights danced beneath new laws, and he began to believe, slowly, quietly, fully, that this was not coexistence. It was corruption. In his adolescence, Tomás entered the Dominican order, a religious brotherhood not known for gentleness or mystical contemplation like some of their Franciscan or monastic cousins, but for precision, intellect, and discipline. The Dominicans were the hounds of God, Dominicanes, and they took this name seriously. Their mission was not simply to worship, but to hunt heresy, to study it, debate it, expose it, and if necessary, purge it. And Tomás, quiet, pale ascetic, thrived in this world. He walked the cloisters barefoot. He fasted for days. He recited long Latin prayers in the dark. He showed no interest in wealth, no hunger for politics, no ambition for leadership. What he wanted, more than anything, was purity of thought, of doctrine, of community. And in those long stone halls lined with candles and crucifixes, he began to forge the idea that salvation was not gentle, that sometimes to save a soul, you had to break the body. His theology was not born from cruelty, but from logic pushed past mercy. If the soul was eternal and the flesh temporary, then what mattered pain? If it could bring obedience? What mattered fear? If it could guide someone to God? If suffering here could prevent damnation later, then wasn't that suffering a gift? This belief did not sprout in isolation. The world around him was shifting. The Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers, was nearing its final act. In the south, Granada still stood, a last Islamic kingdom holding fast against the Catholic tide, but the rest of Spain was moving steadily toward consolidation. And with every victory, with every Muslim kingdom that fell, the idea of a unified Christian Spain grew more seductive, and with it came fear, not fear of armies, but fear of difference. You see, the people who frightened Tomás the most were not open pagans or enemies in foreign cities, but those who were among the faithful, those who said the prayers, wore the symbols, crossed themselves before meals, and yet still whispered in Hebrew, or kept the Quran behind false walls, or lit Shabbat candles in hidden cellars long after the streets had fallen silent. These people, these conversos, moriscos, and secret heretics, were, to him, far more dangerous than armies, because they corrupted from within. And as Tomás grew into manhood, as he moved from monastery to court, from cloister to cathedral, he came to believe something absolute. That faith must be defended not just from enemies, but from impostors. It was this belief that drew the attention of Queen Isabella Castile, a woman known for her piety, her austerity, and her fierce desire to build a kingdom where church and crown walked hand in hand. She saw in Tomás a man not swayed by flattery, not interested in gold or land, but entirely consumed by doctrine, and she brought him into her court not as a politician, but as her confessor, a spiritual guide whose whispers would shape the laws of a nation. And whisper he did. He whispered of false converts, of hidden rituals, of souls in peril behind Christian masks. He whispered of rot beneath painted ceilings, of the need to cleanse a church, not with sermons, but with courts and chains and fire. To Tomás, heresy was not opinion. It was infection, and the only cure was extraction. By the late 1470s, he had convinced Isabella and Ferdinand that Spain could never truly be unified, never truly holy, until it was purified, until every tongue that spoke against God was silenced, until every household that practiced another faith in secret was exposed and corrected. And so, with papal blessing and royal decree, the seeds it planted began to grow, slowly at first, then rapidly, into something monstrous. And Tomás, quiet no longer, became the architect of tribunals, of confessions, of flames. By the time Tomás de Torquemada rose from the narrow stone corridors of monastic life and stepped into the wide, echoing chambers of royal power, he was no longer merely a priest nor a quiet scholar in black robes lost among scripture and shadows. He had become something else entirely, something harder, something that did not shine or sway with emotion, but that moved slowly, inevitably, like the turning of a millstone, grinding centuries of belief into one brutal truth. That purity must be enforced not through preaching or persuasion, but through investigation, through exposure, and when necessary, through flame. His rise to influence came not with blood or fury, but with a whisper into the right ear, a whisper delivered calmly, carefully, to a queen already devout, already fearful of fracture, and already dreaming of united Spain bathed in one belief, one truth, one God. Queen Isabella Castile, fiercely pious, deeply obedient to the church, had long sought counsel from men who told her what she hoped to hear, that her kingdom was blessed, that her people were righteous, that her soul was secure. But when she turned to Torquemada, she heard something different. He did not flatter. He did not soothe. He warned. He warned her that heresy was not distant. It was not far away, not limited to distant lands or foreign tongues. Heresy, he said, was here, within the walls of her kingdom, within the walls of her court, even within the walls of the churches she had worked so hard to protect. There were those, he whispered, who had outwardly converted but inwardly remained loyal to their old faiths. Conversos Moriscos, those who claimed Christianity by mouth but still lit Shabbat candles in hidden rooms, who washed secretly for prayer, who passed down languages and rites from parent to child like contraband. They were Christians in name, but pagans in heart, and they were, he told her, more dangerous than open enemies, because they corroded the faith within like worms in fruit. To a queen desperate to hold together a fragile, newly unified realm, this vision was terrifying and compelling. And so in 1478, with the approval of Pope Sixtus IV, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand signed a decree that would birth the Spanish Inquisition, not as a mere extension of the church, but as a uniquely Spanish force, one not bound to Rome but to crown, with power that reached beyond borders and past confessions. And though the decree bore the monarch's names and the Vatican seal, its soul belonged to Torquemada. For years, he laid the groundwork, silently, slowly, drafting procedures, selecting loyal men, creating an architecture of fear that could not be traced to any one act, but would come to define an entire era. When he was appointed Grand Inquisitor in 1483, the position was new, but he already understood what it needed to be. Not a title, but a function, not a man, but a mechanism through which the church and crown could cleanse the land of those who threatened its spiritual unity. And he did not hesitate. He moved quickly to establish tribunals across Spain, first in Seville, then Toledo, Valencia, Zaragoza, and beyond. Each one operated with its own network of informants, its own prisons, its own records, but all reporting to the central authority of the Grand Inquisitor. These were not noisy institutions. They operated like the heartbeat of a sick man, unseen but constant, felt only in pain and panic, always present beneath the surface of daily life. No one knew who would be accused next, and that, for Torquemada, was part of the point. Accusation required no proof. It required no trial by jury. All that was needed was a whisper, a letter, a suspicion, perhaps sparked by jealousy, by fear, by an old grudge or a vague gesture misinterpreted. Once accused, a person was seized by night, dragged from their homes, stripped of rights, and locked in darkness, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, denied the name of their accuser, denied the charges, denied any form of defense beyond what they could confess. And when they were finally brought before the tribunal, it was not to argue their innocence. It was to answer why they had sinned, why they had lied about their faith, why they had spoken forbidden words, why they had failed to live in absolute obedience. To resist was to suffer. To confess was to be condemned anyway. The punishment did not come at once. First came the questioning, and if the answers were unsatisfactory, or if they were delivered too quickly or too confidently, the inquisitors would assume guilt, and what followed was not argument but torture. Cold, quiet, deliberate torture, not done in rage, but in ritual, overseen by priests, accompanied by prayers, as if pain were merely another form of liturgy. The strappado, where the accused were hung by the wrist behind their back, then dropped suddenly, tearing muscles, snapping shoulders. The rack, which slowly pulled limbs apart. The water cure, in which rags were soaked and forced down the throat to simulate drowning. The iron collar, the thumbscrew, the branding irons. Each tool used not to punish but to reveal, because Torquemada believed, utterly and absolutely, that the truth must be extracted, even if it broke the body in the process. And when the confessions came, real or imagined, forced or free, the accused were sentenced. Some were forced to march through the streets in shame, wearing sanbenitos, tunics emblazoned with crosses and flames, marking them as penitent sinners. Others were imprisoned for years, their property seized, their families ruined, and those who refused to repent or who were caught again, or who were simply deemed too dangerous to live, were handed to the secular arm for execution. But executions under Torquemada were not silent. They were not hidden. They were theatrical, and he intended them to be so. The auto de fe, or act of faith, became public ritual, part sermon, part trial, part execution. Entire cities turned out to watch as those found guilty were marched through the streets to great open squares, where wooden platforms stood waiting. Choirs sang, priests preached, banners flew, and then, under the clear Spanish sky, the condemned were tied to stakes, their robes soaked in oil and burned alive, not with haste, but slowly, so that the fire could purify them inch by inch. All of it, to Torquemada, was not horror, it was justice. And it worked. The people became afraid, not just of the Inquisition, but of each other. Families stopped speaking openly. Neighbors watched neighbors. Entire communities dissolved under suspicion. And through that fear, Torquemada built something far more powerful than law. He built control. By the time of his death in 1498, it's estimated that at least 2,000 people have been executed, tens of thousands more punished, their property confiscated, their lives shattered. Hundreds of thousands of Jews have been expelled, forced to abandon their homes or convert under threat of death. Churches were cleansed, books were burned, and in place of doubt, obedience had taken root. He died quietly in a monastery. No public trial, no judgment, just silence. But what he built did not die with him. It continued, decade after decade, a machine that outlived its maker, grinding belief into conformity, fear into tradition, until the line between faith and fire was no longer visible at all. By the time the Spanish Inquisition reached its peak under Torquemada's iron guidance, brutality had ceased to be an aberration. It had become an institution, dressed in robes, written in ledgers, and sanctified by the steady rhythm of ritual. What began as whispered warnings in the Queen's ear had now become a system. A vast network of fear, surveillance, punishment, and above all, certainty. The kind of certainty that does not waver, does not doubt, and does not flinch when smoke rises in the plaza and flesh becomes ash beneath a burning cross. Torquemada's most terrifying acts were not spontaneous outbursts of violence, nor were they fueled by passion or hatred. Rather, they were cold, methodical, and planned. Every execution had its place in a larger pattern. Every interrogation followed a procedure. Every tribunal fed data back into growing files of the Inquisition. Names, confessions, family trees, rumors, patterns of behavior. All collected, cataloged, and judged. The brutality began with accusation, and in Torquemada, Spain, anyone could accuse anyone. It might be a jealous rival, a suspicious neighbor, a relative eager to seize an inheritance. You didn't need evidence. You only needed fear. And once the accusation was made, it didn't matter if it was grounded in truth or lies. The machine began to turn. Those accused were taken secretly, often in the dead of night, escorted by inquisitorial guards cloaked in black, dragged from homes as families wept and begged for answers that never came. The accused were not told who had denounced them. They were not shown proof. They were simply removed like a sickness from the body of the nation and locked away in hidden dungeons, cold, windowless cells beneath stone churches and repurposed castles, where time became elastic and hope drained like water through cracks in the floor. Inside those cells, prisoners waited, sometimes days, sometimes months, and always they waited alone, with no lawyer, no visitors, no knowledge when or if they would be summoned. When they finally were, it was before the tribunal, a panel of priests and judges appointed by the Inquisition, seated behind wooden desks on a glow of flickering candlelight, their faces calm, their voices soft, their hands resting beside volumes of canon law. The accused stood chained, often barefoot, in robes stiff with dirt, expected to defend themselves without knowing the charges. If they confessed, the process accelerated. If they begged for clarity, the pressure intensified. And if they denied, if they hesitated, if they asked too many questions or showed too much pride, then came the torture. Torquemada's Inquisition did not use torture recklessly. They used it strategically, as an extension of divine mercy, as a means of forcing the soul to submit before it was too late. Pain was purification, and under Torquemada's rule, pain became a language all its own. The strappado was among the most common methods. The prisoners' hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted high by a rope over a pulley, then dropped suddenly, wrenching the arms from their sockets, sometimes shattering bone. If they did not confess, the process was repeated again and again until the silence broke. Another favorite method was the rack, where the body was laid out and slowly stretched, inch by inch, until joints dislocated and tendons tore. The pain was not sharp, but deep, crawling through the spine and hips, cracking the sense of identity and time. Inquisitors would pause between turns to ask gentle questions, to encourage repentance, to offer mercy, but only if the right words were spoken. There was ataka or water torture, where rags were stuffed into the mouth and water poured over them to simulate drowning. The victim could neither breathe nor scream, only thrash. To the Inquisition, this was not cruelty. It was the soul gasping for redemption. Many confessed, whether truly guilty or not. Some gave the names of friends or lovers or family members, hoping to stop the agony. Others confessed anything at all, any sin, real or imagined, just to make it end. But confession was only the beginning. Once judged guilty, punishment followed. Inquisitors offered penance for the repentant, long pilgrimages, public flagellation, forced labor in church service, or life imprisonment. But for the unrepentant, for those who denied or recanted, or who were condemned as relapsed heretics, there was only one sentence: death by fire. And Torquemada ensured it was seen. The auto de fe became the Inquisition's final act, not in a court, but in the open in the town square, where the public could watch and be reminded. It began with a mass, then a procession. The condemned were dressed in sanbenitos, yellow robes painted with flames or demons, with tall conical hats to mark them as sinners. They were paraded through streets lined with onlookers, some horrified, some weeping, some grateful it wasn't them. Then they were tied to stakes, surrounded by bundles of dry wood, and as prayers were sung, the flames were lit. These burnings were not hidden executions. They were choreographed rituals, with priests blessing the fire, nobles in attendance, and children watching from shoulders. It was both judgment and theater, and Torquemada wanted it that way. His brutality didn't stop at individuals. He targeted entire communities. The Jewish population, long integrated into Spanish cities, was systematically dismantled. Under his influence, the monarchs issued the Edict of Expulsion in 1492, ordering all practicing Jews to either convert or leave Spain within 4 months. Over 100,000 Jews were displaced. Many died in the journey. Many others converted publicly, only to be later hunted by the Inquisition as false Christians. He seized their lands, their businesses, their books, their graves. He turned their synagogues into churches and their homes into prisons. To him, this was not hatred. It was protection. He believed he was saving Spain from decay, that he was building a kingdom free of falsehood, a land where everyone believed the same, prayed the same, and feared the same cross. And even when critics whispered that it had gone too far, even when Rome hesitated at the sheer volume of cases, even when the Pope himself began to question the scale of the executions, Torquemada stood firm. He believed any pause, any hesitation, would be weakness. He believed mercy, once extended, would be exploited. He believed that Spain must choose purity or chaos. There was no in between. By the time he died in 1498, his hands were clean, but his legacy soaked the soil of Spain with smoke and guilt. Thousands tortured, thousands more executed, hundreds of thousands displaced. A kingdom reshaped through pain. And the scariest part? He never doubted himself. Not once. He did not die by fire. He did not face trial, nor hear the sentence he had spoken so often echoed back at him. There were no crowds, no stake, no confession torn from his chest. Tomás de Torquemada died quietly in 1498 in the cool stone stillness of the monastery at Avila, surrounded not by victims, but by the silence of God, a silence he believed he had served completely. No final reckoning, no moment of doubt, only a man who believed, until his final breath, that his mission had been righteous. By then, he had spent 15 years shaping the Spanish Inquisition into a machine that operated even without him, a mechanism of control, a fear of uniformity that stretched across every city, every village, every whisper. Under his leadership, thousands had been tortured, executed, or forced into exile. Entire communities were erased. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had been cast out, their wealth confiscated, their families scattered. And yet to Torquemada, this was not tragedy. It was order. It was the price of salvation. To some, he was a saint in sackcloth, incorruptible and holy, immune to luxury, devoted only to truth. To others, he was a fanatic, a man who replaced compassion with dogma, who saw doubt as disease and mercy as betrayal. But no matter what name history gave him, saint, zealot, monster, the fires he lit did not die with him. The Inquisition continued for centuries after his death, changing shape, shifting focus, but always carrying the fingerprints of its first Grand Inquisitor. Tribunals would go on judging souls. Confessions would still be torn from lips in dark rooms. Fires would still be lit under the open sky, and banners would still be raised in the name of faith. And in the minds of many, long after his bones turned to dust, Torquemada became a symbol, not just of cruelty, but of certainty taken too far, a man so convinced of righteousness that he could no longer see the people he condemned, only the sins he imagined behind their eyes. His name survives not in hymns, but in shadows, not in prayer, but in warning. And so, as the last echo of his breath fades into the cloisters of history, we turn our gaze east, not at dungeons, but to drawing rooms, not of fire, but of poison, to velvet and deception, and the whispered politics of a royal court so refined, so elegant, it almost hid the rot beneath the surface. Because in the shadows of Louis XIV's golden court, another kind of terror grew, quieter, subtler, but just as deadly. As the last embers of the Inquisition smolder in the stone hearts of Spain, we cross the Pyrenees and step into a very different fire. One that doesn't burn, but slips silently into wine cups and perfume vials. In the glittering halls of Versailles, under the gaze of Louis XIV, power wore lace and smiles, and death came not with flames, but with powders, potions, and invisible hands. Here, secrets weren't tortured out. They were bought, sold, and sometimes killed for. Now, we enter the world of whispers and poisons, the court of shadows. Enter the Poison King of France, Louis XIV's court of shadows. Beneath the chandeliers of Versailles, where sunlight danced off mirrors and powdered wigs at thinning crowns, a darker current pulsed quietly through the polished marble floors. They called him the Sun King, and to the world, Louis XIV ruled in brilliance. But behind the gilded walls, whispers bloomed like mold, rumors curdled into poison, and death wore the scent of roses. In this world of silk and surveillance, it wasn't just the king who ruled, it was fear, not of open war or rebellion, but of what might be in your wine or who might want you gone. This was the court of shadows. Before the vast halls of Versailles echoed with footsteps soft as sighs, and the air itself shimmered with the scent of perfumed intrigue. Before the court of France was wrapped in lace, gilded in gold, and slowly poisoned with secrets before he became the Sun King around whom the world seemed to orbit. Louis XIV was simply a boy born into uncertainty and raised amid turbulence. A child not yet royal in mind, but already drowning in the heavy waters of symbolism, politics, and fragile hope. His very birth was considered a miracle, a divine answer to decades of disappointment. For his mother, Anne of Austria, had spent 23 years childless in her marriage to Louis XIII, and with each passing year, the pressure mounted, the whispers grew louder, and the future of the Bourbon line seemed ever more fragile, until finally, in the late summer of 1638, Louis d'Eudon entered the world, his name itself meaning God-given, a label that would weigh on his shoulders like a crown. Before he ever wore one, from the very beginning, he was more symbol than son, more vessel than boy, and while he was adored by his mother, who saw him as both gift and salvation, he was also watched with political eyes, measured constantly not for what he was, but for what he represented. Continuity, legitimacy, the glue to hold a brittle monarchy together. When Louis XIII died in 1643, Louis XIV was barely 5 years old. Too young to rule, too small to understand the tide shifting beneath him, but old enough to feel the sudden gravity that came with being king, even if in name only. And so it was Anne of Austria, now Queen Regent, who took the reins of power, ruling in her son's name alongside her trusted advisor, Cardinal Mazarin, an Italian-born clergyman and diplomat whose influence over Queen, and thus the kingdom, quickly drew suspicion and resentment from the French nobility. It was during these early years that the young Louis first tasted the bitterness of power not yet possessed, the vulnerability of wearing a crown without the means to defend it, and this lesson was carved into him not through courtly tutelage or philosophical reflection, but through terror and displacement. For during the series of civil wars known as the Fronde, the royal family was driven from Paris by angry mobs, forced to flee their own capital under threat of violence, forced to sleep in damp fortresses and frozen country estates, their royal dignity reduced to survival. The Fronde, which spanned from 1648 to 1653, was not merely a political rebellion, but a social and cultural fracture, a rejection of centralized power by nobles who feared the erosion of their influence. And for the boy king, it became a crucible, forging in him a deep, cold awareness that loyalty was a performance, that flattery could vanish overnight, and that the state, if it were to endure, must be held not just with the elegance of rule, but with the ruthless grip of absolute control. He watched his mother weep in private, saw Mazarin retreat and return, heard the shouts of commoners who once called him angel and now hurled stones, and in those moments, some part of him hardened, became vigilant, became obsessed with the idea that no king could ever be safe unless he ruled completely, visibly, and without equal. So when Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, leaving the kingdom technically leaderless, many expected the new king, still young but already steeped in the protocols of royal behavior, to appoint another minister, someone to handle the affairs of state while he pursued the pleasures of courtly life. But instead, Louis stunned his advisors by announcing that he would rule alone, that no one else would speak for him, that the era of ministers was over, and in doing so, he began one of the most ambitious political projects in European history. The transformation of the French monarchy into a theater of power so radiant, so tightly controlled, that it would blind its rivals and dazzle its allies. And the stage for this theater would be Versailles. Built initially as a modest hunting lodge by his father, Versailles was remade under Louis into a symbol of divine rule, a palace so vast, so meticulously designed, that every hallway, every mirror, every garden pathway reinforced the idea that the king was not merely a man, but the earthly reflection of God's perfection, the fixed center around which all nobility must orbit, and in doing so, he effectively relocated the power of the realm from the chaotic streets of Paris to the manicured lawns of his golden prison. There at Versailles, Louis demanded attendance from his nobles, forced them to live under his eye, lured them with favors and punished them with silence, and slowly, steadily, he replaced their sword with ribbons, their ambitions with etiquette, their conspiracies with meaningless ceremonies, until the court became a machine of ritual, and every move a noble made was in response to the king's carefully choreographed presence. Yet while the Sun King cultivated this brilliant system of absolute monarchy, a different kind of power began to stir in the darker corners of France. Not in the throne room or the council chamber, but in the salons and alleyways, in the whispered promises of fortune tellers and the secret trades of apothecaries, where powders were passed in coded words and prayers were twisted into curses. And behind the polished mirrors of Versailles, an invisible contagion crept. It began subtly. An illness here, a miscarriage there, a rival who died too soon, or a husband who never woke. And soon there were rumors, quiet but persistent, of poison, of magic, of dark ceremonies held beneath the city. And when these whispers reached the ears of the king, he did not dismiss them as superstition, for he, above all, understood that control was not just about presence, but about perception. And if poison moved in shadows, then he would become the light that exposed it. But he would wait. He would let the whispers grow, let the net tighten, until it caught not just the poor and the desperate, but the glittering elite, the same nobles who bowed and danced and praised him, the same ones who dared, in secret, to bend fate to their will. And when that moment came, Louis would strike not with sword, but with spectacle, and in doing so, he would remind his court, his country, and all of Europe that while the sun may cast warmth and beauty, it can also burn. Thus, the stage was set, and behind the powdered faces and embroidered smiles of Versailles, the greatest scandal of Louis's reign began to stir. A scandal not of war or policy, but poison, prophecy, and quiet executions, all hidden beneath the shining surface of France's golden age. To truly understand the transformation of Louis XIV, from a boy king haunted by the memory of civil war into an all-powerful sovereign whose gaze dictated the rhythm of an entire nation, one must enter the palace he built not merely with stone and gold, but with intention, surveillance, and spectacle. The Palace of Versailles, shimmering in light and echoing with music, was not a royal residence alone. It was a stage, a labyrinth, a pressured chamber where every glance was a calculation, every silence a sentence, and every guest a prisoner dressed in lace. Following the death of Cardinal Mazarin in 1661, Louis made a decision that would define the era and astonish even the most seasoned courtiers. He refused to appoint another chief minister, declaring instead that he would rule alone, as an absolute monarch, unmediated and undiluted. To many, it seemed a romantic notion, the stuff of ancient Rome or idealized antiquity. But Louis, shaped by the chaos of the Fronde and the humiliation of fleeing his capital, knew precisely what he was doing. He would be his own minister, his own judge, his own son. His transformation began not in grand proclamations, but in the quiet restructuring of state machinery. He summoned reports directly to himself, held council meetings where he alone spoke, and demanded updates from military, finance, and religious institutions with an obsessive frequency. Control was not delegated. It was absorbed. And yet, the genius of Louis was that his iron grip was often hidden behind the softest of gloves. His tyranny did not wear a sneer. It wore a smile, a powdered wig, and a courtly nod. At Versailles, he constructed a world where power was proximity. The closer one stood to the king, the more influence one held. And so nobles, once fractious warlords of the provinces, now competed for the privilege of handing the king his gloves or watching him dress in the morning. Ceremonies became currency. Rituals replaced rebellion. And all the while, Louis watched. But power, Louis understood, was not only about controlling the living. It was also about controlling the narrative. So he patronized the arts like no monarch before him. Painters, playwrights, and poets flooded the court, turning the king into myth. He danced as Apollo, the sun god, embodying the divine right of kings and ballet. His likeness adorned tapestries, ceilings, and coinage. He was no longer simply the king. He was France itself. And yet, beneath the orchestration, something darker simmered. Because while Louis controlled the image, the salons and side chambers whispered of poison, infidelity, and death. It began slowly, almost invisibly. A countess fell ill. A courtier collapsed at dinner. Rumors of potion sellers and fortune tellers made their way from the gutters of Paris to the golden walls of Versailles. And Louis, ever the strategist, did not panic. He listened. He commissioned investigations, quietly at first, then more publicly. The infamous affair of the poisons would come to light. A tangled web of noble women, clergy, alchemists, and hired poisoners, all connected by greed, ambition, and a belief that the court was immune to consequence. But it wasn't. Louis ensured it wasn't. Arrests were made. Tortures were sanctioned. Trials were held. Names, even those belonging to the highest-ranking ladies, were dragged into the dirt. But here, too, Louis played his game with precision. He did not destroy the court. He purged it selectively. Those who fell were examples. The rest learned to kneel better. He created a special court, the Chamber Ardente, to deal with poisoners and practitioners of black magic. Over 400 suspects were interrogated. Some were executed. Others vanished into prisons. And throughout it all, Louis stood untouched, a figure of divine judgment, not tangled in the sin, but elevated above it, shining brighter because of it. Through these events, his power deepened. His enemies became more cautious. The nobility, once daring, now trembled. And the people, far below the gold and silk of Versailles, learned to view the king not just as ruler, but as destiny made flesh. This was the transformation of Louis XIV. Not just a king, but a living institution, a man who blended fear with beauty, spectacle with surveillance, and grace with absolute control. He did not need to shout. He only needed to exist. And the shadows he cast, even in sunlight, were long indeed. At first glance, the reign of Louis XIV appears to shimmer with golden splendor, an era of operas, polished marble, and manicured gardens where nobility danced in step, and every morning began with a bow. But beneath this carefully choreographed grandeur, beneath the cascading curtains and perfume-drenched corridors of Versailles, there pulsed a steady rhythm of quiet cruelty, sharpened ambition, and punishment wrapped in etiquette. For Louis, brutality was never loud. It was soft-spoken, elegantly dressed, and executed with the same precision as the folding of a lace handkerchief. He had learned, early on, that the most effective violence was not theatrical, but administrative. The affair of the poisons was not just a scandal. It was an awakening, a signal to the king that beneath the carefully arranged social order's court, there festered rot, and that rot needed to be exposed, measured, and purged. When whispers of poisonings and black masses began filtering into his intelligence networks, Louis moved not with panic, but with cold, measured efficiency. He created the Chamber Ardente, a tribunal that operated with an eerie silence and almost papal authority, dealing exclusively with cases involving poison, witchcraft, and occult conspiracies. The court became a furnace in which accusations were burned into fact, and confessions drawn with fire and steel. Behind closed doors, aristocrats once too proud to kneel were shackled and interrogated. Some screamed, others wept. Many simply withered in the face of Louis's unblinking gaze, because what truly terrified them was not the possibility of death, but the sudden realization that even their titles, their fortunes, their birthright, none of it could shield them from the king's silent verdict. Louis didn't have to touch them. He only had to withdraw favor. And in the court of the Sun King, social death was often worse than the real one. The brutality was systemic, buried in paperwork and whispered orders. Men and women were imprisoned indefinitely without trial and lettre de cachet signed by the king himself, sealed with his insignia, carrying the force of law with the finality of a guillotine. No explanation was required. No defense permitted. A husband could disappear. A daughter could be removed from her home. And the neighbors, watching from behind drawn curtains, would only nod in understanding. They had displeased the king. Poisoners were tortured with methods designed not only to extract confessions, but to extract names. The rack twisted limbs until joints cracked. The strappado hoisted prisoners by bound wrists, letting them fall suddenly and wrenching their shoulders out of socket. Boiling irons, forced ingestion of emetics, and ritualistic humiliations turned the human body into a ledger of punishment for those accused of black masses. The interrogations were not just physical but spiritual. Were demons summoned? Were hosts desecrated? Was royal blood the target? In this time, women bore the brunt of suspicion, especially those whose power came from proximity to noblemen or influence in courtly intrigues. Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, was a central figure in the poison rings. She admitted to selling love potions, performing dark rites, and arranging deaths for aristocratic clients. But her confessions, dragged out over months, were just the beginning. Through her, the investigators traced a sprawling network of clients: duchesses, counts, mistresses, priests. The reach of the affair horrified the court. Even Madame de Montespan, the king's former mistress and mother of his children, was implicated. Her name spoken under duress by prisoners too broken to lie. Louis never brought her trial, but she was removed silently and completely from the center of power, her fall absolute and irreversible. And that was Louis's way. He did not need spectacle. He needed only to vanish those who troubled the surface of his perfect reign. Executions were public, but elegant. Beheading, burning, and hanging were wrapped in ritual. The condemned wore robes, paraded before the people, offered final words, or were gagged if their tongues were too bold. Crowds gathered in nervous awe, not so much cheering the deaths as absorbing the lesson, that even the beautiful could fall, that even those close to the king could become shadows on the gallows. Beyond the poisoners, Louis extended his reach into the Protestant population. Though once tolerant, he began a quiet campaign to erase their existence, culminating in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Protestant churches were closed, pastors exiled, and families torn apart. Soldiers were sent to live in Huguenot homes, a practice called dragonnades, to convert them by coercion or by violence if necessary. Hundreds of thousands fled. Those who remained were watched, their every word measured. And Louis, convinced of divine righteousness, saw it all not as cruelty, but as correction. In his wars, too, his brutality took form, not on the battlefield, but in the burning of villages, the salting of fields, the forced migrations that followed campaigns through Flanders, the Palatinate, and Savoy. He believed in total dominance, not just over enemies, but over their ability to recover. Civilians suffered, cities starved. But Louis remained unmoved, convinced that such devastation was the price of lasting peace. It was not madness. It was design. Louis XIV was not a madman foaming with rage. He was a sculptor of obedience, and brutality was his chisel. Every exile, every execution, every whisper silenced by decree was part of a single long sentence written across decades of power. I am unchallengeable. By the time the affair of the poisons was officially concluded, over 30 people had been executed, hundreds imprisoned, and an entire generation of nobles had learned that even in a palace of mirrors, there were blind corners, and the king saw through all of them. This was not chaos. It was clarity, and in that clarity, fear bloomed, quiet and perfumed, just as Louis intended. Louis XIV did not fall to scandal, to uprising, or the kind of dramatic death that so often closes the chapters of brutal men. He did not flee his palace. He did not weep before a crowd or beg forgiveness for the lives he extinguished. No, his end came slowly, surrounded by gold, incense, and the soft murmur of prayers. In the waning days of summer in 1715, after 72 years on the throne, Louis died of gangrene at the Palace of Versailles, the very monument to control and magnificence he had spent a lifetime constructing. He died as he had lived, on display. But what remained was not merely a crown passed to a young successor. What remained was a nation transformed by the sheer force of his will. His wars had exhausted the treasury. His edicts had reshaped religion and broken communities. His court had become the model for monarchies across Europe. Copied not for its mercy, but for its precision, his palace stood as a symbol of divine kingship, even as cracks formed beneath its mirrors. To his supporters, Louis left a legacy of order. They praised his patronage of the arts, his centralization of power, his ability to tame the nobility and craft a nation that obeyed not because it was forced to, but because it had learned no other way. To others, he left behind a blueprint of tyranny, a silent, perfumed tyranny that operated not on blood alone, but on the erosion of dissent, the quiet vanishing of rivals, the subtle manipulation of fear. The affair of the poisons never truly disappeared from the public imagination. It lingered like a scent, tied forever to the image of Versailles, to the whispers in the hallways, to the dark knowledge that beauty could hide the grotesque. And in every monarchy that rose and fell after him, in every palace that sought to recreate the image of a court in balance, there was always a trace of Louis's design, the spectacle of power and the silence beneath it. In the centuries to come, as revolution swept through France and monarchs were dragged from their thrones, the Sun King's light dimmed into something colder. His body was laid to rest in St. Denis, but his influence was buried deep in the architecture authority, how it looked, how it moved, and how it punished. Louis XIV ruled longer than any monarch in European history. But time eventually claimed even him. And when marble cracked and the court dispersed, one truth remained. His reign was not remembered only for what it built, but for what it erased. And now, as we leave the court shadows behind, we turn our eyes to a darker dusk still, to the next figure, one without a throne but with just as much power. Because in the salons and poisonings of Versailles, death was delivered by strangers. But in our next story, death would come from the family dinner table. And the killer? Perhaps the most terrifying of them all. Someone you were meant to trust. We leave behind the mirrored halls of Versailles and its perfumed decay, where power hid behind elegance and death wore rouge on its cheeks. But cruelty is not confined to kings, nor is terror always dressed in gold. Sometimes, it wears the face of a mother, the smile of a cousin, the calm of nobility. Our next descent is not into a palace, but into a castle of blood. Here, the candles are dimmer, the corridors colder, and the horrors far more personal. Because now, we walk into the legend of Elizabeth Bathory, the woman who bathed in blood. After walking through centuries of silence, fire, blood, and poison, one question still hangs heavy in the air. Who was the most brutal of them all? Was it Ivan the Terrible, who carved his fear into every wall of Russia, who crushed his own bloodline and created a legacy soaked in suspicion? Was it Vlad the Impaler, who turned war into spectacle, built forests of the dead, and made cruelty his signature? Was it Elizabeth Bathory, whose cruelty was intimate and methodical, committed not for war or power, but beneath velvet ceilings and behind locked doors? Was it Torquemada, whose brutality came not from rage, but from righteousness, who believed that every scream burned sin away? Or was it Louis XIV, the man who killed with distance, who made cruelty beautiful, and taught the world that silence and power can poison more effectively than swords? In the end, their horrors were different, but they shared one truth. They believed they were justified. Whether through faith, fear, beauty, or divine right, they all believed the pain they caused served a higher order.